Ever since the 1960s, the question regarding the specificity of the iconic sign mainly discussed on example of pictures. The contradistinction to other kinds of signs has been subject of lively debate in general semiotics. In the course of discussion, the Pusian notion of iconicity came in for criticism by philosophers such as Arthur Bierman and Nelson Goodman, as well as semioticians such as Umberto Eco and Cornel Lindekens. In opposition to this critic, Johan Sonesson introduced his own view which defended iconicity. Arguments against iconic sign formulated by Arthur Bierman and counter-arguments presented by Johan Sonesson will be the main subject of our presentation.
So we will start with Bierman arguments against iconicity. And the first argument will be metaphysical one. So, in the world there are some universal categories, which means everything in the universe shares some characteristic with each other. The thing is an iconicity sign in virtue of its denoting those objects which have the same characteristic which it exhibits. That leads to the conclusion that everything in the universe iconically denotes everything, and everything in the universe is denoted by any other thing. That seems hardly suitable because we will have to call everything a sign, and everything would be a sign. By introducing negative connotation, we will be able to avoid the consequence of ambiguous denotation. That's, however, introduced connotation with which iconic signs were supposed to have dispensed. The metaphysical arguments have another consequence. Conventional signs have denotative freedom. It can denote nothing, one, or many things. The iconic sign could not have any of those features for as long as we want to introduce negative connotation. And due to that, it would be hard to consider iconic sign in the usual sense at all. The second argument, the null denotation argument. There are some conventional signs that denote nothing because nothing in the universe possesses sign signification. But can iconic sign describe nothing? If the resemblance relation holds between two things, at least one of the terms of that relation will be an iconic sign. Resemblance relation is reflexive, what means that iconic sign denotes itself. Due to this statement, iconic sign cannot have null denotation. The third argument, the new uniqueness argument. Even if we not include that iconic sign denote itself, can it have null denotation? For iconic sign to have null denotation, it must be unique. It cannot resemble anything else in the universe. But according to Morris, resemblance is what makes iconic sign an iconic sign. That means iconic sign cannot have both null denotation and be an iconic sign.
The next argument is the diversity argument. If every distinct object in the universe were unique in all respects, we could conclude by the previous argument that no object could be an iconic sign. And we cannot decide about rejecting specific characteristics of the objects just to make it sign. This kind of sign is more about being under convention, which in our case is useless because iconic signs are all about resemblance to the real object in the universe. The fifth argument is the residue argument. Suppose that on the basis of some of the residue characteristics, an object will resemble one class of objects, and other residue characteristics will resemble on another class of objects. On the other hand, we can eliminate this ambiguity if we specify which characteristics constitute the sign signification. Doing that, we have to state the connotation of the sign, so our distinction between conventional and iconic sign is disappearing. The symmetricality argument. According to Bierman, if an object resembles to another object is sufficient for its being an iconic sign, we have no way of deciding which of the two objects is the icon for resemblance is a symmetrical relation. To make this argument a little bit easier to understand, when we have two objects resembling, we have to decide which one is going to be the notation. In this moment, iconic sign loses its attributes. In simple words, symmetrically being resembled to one object without interference of a human. The next argument is the correct application argument. Apart from the first argument about universal characteristics, we should make it clear it is possible for an icon to resemble nothing in the universe? Yes, it's logically possible, but going further, if it resembles nothing, then it has no signification. So we have no criterion for deciding if the obligation is correct or not.
So there is the last argument, the unchanged meaning argument. From Socrates' thought that iconic sign applied correctly or incorrectly won't change its meaning, we can try to look if iconic sign applied even correctly can change its meaning, which will make an iconic sign lack one of the features sign needs to have. Best way to show that is to present Biermann's example. Suppose that an iconic sign resembles only x because they alone share characteristics C1 and C2. X will be the sign's denotation and C1 and C2 will constitute its signification. Suppose everything in the world undergoes change except our iconic sign. We look about and notice that it now resembles Y because it shares characteristics C3 and C4 with it. Y will be its denotation now and characteristics C3 and C4 constitute its signification. The way to say that iconic sign has its meaning is its denotative and significative sense, due to lack of its connotation. But example shows that iconic signs, even if applied correctly, it changes its meaning.
So, the opposite view was presented by Somerson in his work that there are many kinds of iconic signs, which shows that there is something wrong with arguments regarding the critique of iconicity. One of them connects with existing universal metaphysical categories, may be called the argument of progression. If you call it quickly, in short, it plays on the idea that there are some universal characteristics which are shared by all things in the world, some in the faculty these things may refer to and be referred to everything else. Thus, if we accept that iconicity is the origin of the science, then everything in the world will be science. According to Biermann, this consequence can be avoided if we introduce a limitation that iconic signs should contain, as a part of its meaning, only these characteristics which are not universal. But presented solution is scarcely acceptable, because it leads to another problem, namely, where set a limit to distinguish two general characteristics from those which still can be included in the meaning of icon. Also, it pays to notice that sheer resemblance does not constitute something as a sign. When we compare two objects in the terms of their similarity, we just establish an iconic ground. The object becomes iconic sign only when one of these objects is taken to stand for the other. So the fact that two things are similar means that these two things provide potentiality for one thing to become an iconic sign for another. Thus, everything in the world can be taken as iconic representation, which may become sign, of course if we use iconic representation as a sign. As Somerson points out, the import of argument of progression actually depends on the way we interpret Peirce's theory. If he meant to suggest that there are three properties, chronicity, indexicality, and symbolicity, which upon themselves and without any further requirements trigger the recognition of something as a sign, then the argument of regression will create trouble for his perception. On the other hand, if he merely wanted to suggest that something that was already recognized as being a sign could be discovered to be an iconical sign, rather than an lexical or symbolic one, by means of tracing it back to iconic grounds, then the argument of regression will have no bearing on it. Another argument that criticizes iconicity is called the symmetry argument. It is based on the idea that the notion of similarity, understood in commonsensical way, can be identified with the equivalence relation of logic. Of course, in the logic, the equivalence relation is symmetrical and reflexive, so you cannot define any type of sign. Because a sign, relation must be asymmetrical and reflexive, but the issuance of Somerson remark to identify similarity with the equivalence relation is to suppose man to live in the world of natural science, when in fact he inhabits a particular sociocultural life world. Similarity, as experienced in the life world, is actually asymmetric and irreflexive. This statement can be supported by experiments carried out, for example, by Roche or Tversky. These experiments, based on hypothetical effects, demonstrated the asymmetry of similarity judgments. Like in the Tversky's experiment, where the subject is task involving comparison between countries, preferred state in North Korea is similar to Red China, and opposite one, Red China is similar to North Korea. This goes to show that unlike the Biermann's view, similarity in semiotic aspect is asymmetric and unreflexive. Furthermore, this also leads to rejection of arguments of symmetry. As Sonesson says, contrary to the argument of regression, the symmetry argument may thus be arrived without introducing a supplementary sign functions and without correct the definition of economic grounds.
Another task in our presentation was to think if there is any of Biermann's argument you have to reject. It's hard to find any of Biermann's arguments being easy to defend. In our opinion, the problem lies in his misunderstanding of the basic concept of icons in sign. For instance, he claims that resemblance between two things already makes one of them an iconic sign of a second one. When resemblance only creates an iconic ground that can lead to create a sign. Due to that, we have to reject all of his arguments and focus on the correct interpretation of how iconic sign can be understood.
In Hochberg and Brooks studies, this experiment was carried out to determine whether the child is able to recognize photographs and two-dimensional light drawings, even without receiving any instruction related to pictorial meaning and content. The first part of testing involved showing the subject 21 pictures. It was organized in such way that the outline drawing of any object preceded any photograph of the same object, so recognition held first with the pictures could not be transferred to the drawing. In the second part, after 1 month, during which child had free access to pictures, he still had to avoid television and motion pictures. Revised task was repeated but with different stimuli. The result of the study showed that the child was able to recognize pictorial representation of solid object without specific training or instruction. It points to some irreducible meaning of a native ability for pictorial recognition. We must infer that there is an unlearned propensity to respond to certain formal features of lines on paper. Our proposition, we thought about extending Hochberg-Brooks experiment to cover iconic sign, different in levels and kind of iconicity, more specifically to use first and second part of testing cards with picture stimuli, black and white line drawing, and raster color photos. For photo stimuli, black and white photos and color photos. Also, we want to add one more kind of stimuli, replica, uniform and color. This modification allowed us to address the following questions. Does iconicity differ in levels or kinds of iconicity have an effect on children performing on a naming task? Does a child is able to recognize replica as a representation of the object without specific training or instruction?
So we got summary. To sum up, ever since 1960s, iconic sign, especially pictorial sign, has been the subject of lively debate in general semiotic philosophers such as Arthur Biermann and Nelson Goodman, as well as semioticians such as Umberto Eco and Renaud Lindekens formulated critique against Peircean notion of archaism. Biermann formulated 8 arguments to support his thesis. In 2 of them, the metaphysical argument of recursion, and the symmetricality argument, which summarized main objections against icon, are discussed extensively in Sonesson writings. Sonesson, in his papers, introduced the reason why this line of reasoning is scarcely acceptable. In our opinion, iconic sign surely exists. Biermann based his arguments on false assumption and conceptual misunderstanding, like in the symmetry arguments, where he identified logic with commonsensical way of understanding of similarity. These findings were supported by psychological experiments, for example, performed by Roche or Tversky, as well as by Hochberg and Brooks studies, which prove that people have some irreducible minimum of native ability for pictorial recognition. So we cannot accept Biemann's Beeman's objections concerning icon of saving from Sonotone Critic.
Is that all? Thank you.
A to ziemka pytacie.
Nie, każdy tego czytał. Can you read this?
There is a question. Great.
How to read?
Patricia Ken.
Tak, dla ducha.
So, I see no questions.
Ja mam pytanie.